Hello, I'm Susan Flory, and this is The Big Middle, my podcast exploring the big issues of longer midlife. My guest this week is one of the leading lights of a growing global movement to change the way we think about aging. Jeanette Leardi is a social gerontologist and a prolific writer and speaker on aging issues. We'll meet Jeanette after we touch base with sponsor Five-A-Side Chess. Here's Ryan Child.
Hey Susan, thanks for getting in touch. I'm on my way down from Basingstoke to Plymouth University today. Little 170-mile trip. We met a woman yesterday I just wanted to tell you about. She got in touch and was just saying, nobody's really ever sitting down and having a chat with me. She felt very lonely and isolated and kind of saw us online. She's now linked up with a guy called Paul that we have down in Oxford who volunteers with the chessboards, meeting up every week to have a chat. And it just struck me that what an amazing thing people can do to offer people the chance to talk. We're doing it a little bit, but if anybody can do it, there are so many people out there looking for these types of connections.
It is all about those connections. If you caught our interview last week, you'll know Ryan's on tour with the Five-A-Side Chess Battling Suicide Bus, helping people across the UK connect by putting down their phones and playing chess. Have a listen to our interview wherever you download The Big Middle. Find out how you can take part at fiveasidechess.com. To my guest, Jeanette Leardi, now joining me down the Skype line from her home in Portland, Oregon. Hey, Jeanette.
Hey, Susan. How are you?
I am fabulous. We have been chatting a lot, DMing on Twitter, me lapping up your posts, all the articles you write on aging. I'm so keen to learn about my new area of interest, and you know plenty. And the reason I know of you is because Ashton Applewhite, the energetic anti-ageism crusader, she mentioned you when she was on the podcast. And she's a dear friend of yours, isn't she?
Yes, she is. And I got a chance to meet her very recently when she came to Portland on her book tour. So it was great to reconnect with her as well.
Now, what are you working on now?
I'm getting prepared to go to the East Coast in May, where I'll be giving several presentations in the Charlotte, North Carolina, and Columbia, South Carolina areas, and then flying up to the Boston area. I'm doing presentations on memory and on shattering the stereotypes of aging.
Who will be in the audience?
Retirement communities, residents of those communities, and at senior centers. I love speaking to the general public because I feel that's where the front line of the anti-ageism movement is, for me at least.
You write and you teach and you speak as a social gerontologist with that academic expertise. Tell us about this strand of gerontology, why you got into it and how it informs everything you do.
Well, social gerontology is that aspect of gerontology that talks about the societal constructs around aging, how people relate to one another in terms of aging, how people relate to the concept of aging. I got into it actually after having been a caregiver for both my aging parents for about 17 years. I've always been a writer and editor. For the past 35 years, I've been writing and editing children's educational materials. But there's nothing like having been a caregiver to make a person realize what the other end of the aging spectrum is like. And that really inspired me to go back to school. And my encore career was gerontology. And I love it.
You're not wearing a white coat and visiting, doing your rounds in a hospital.
No, I'm a social gerontologist who's out in the general public and talking to businesses and basically anyone who will listen about the need to change our attitudes about aging.
Now, much of your work is aimed at changing people's attitudes, their perspectives on aging. Tell us about the 3 tools that you've told me you use to do this in the various ways that you do.
Well, these are 3 tools we all have. We have our ideas, we have our words, and we have our actions. But as Ashton Applewhite says, it all starts between our ears, in our brains. How do we think about aging and how do other people think about aging? What happens between our ears, if it's negative, that's what I call prejudice. Once we then marry those ideas with words or with actions, then it becomes bigotry. So I think in order to stop the scourge of ageism, which I really do believe is a scourge, we need to start changing our ideas first. And only then can we be more sensitive to the words that we use and to the ways that we act toward one another and toward ourselves as older adults. And I consider myself an older adult. I'm 67 and I'm proud of it.
Right, good. You declare your birthday, you declare your chronological age. Well, that's great. I like to do so too. I mean, I'm 61 and I'm amazed at, I feel just like I've always felt, as anyone who's accumulated the years often says.
Exactly. The thing that people need to realize, and it's understandable why people don't realize it, is because we have such negative attitudes about aging that have lasted for millennia. We all need to realize that there are assets to aging. As we get older, we accumulate some really good things. So it's not that I'm being a Pollyanna about aging. We may be losing certain physical abilities or cognitive speed of processing in our brains, but we gain other really wonderful things. And that's the flip side of it, is what people need to hear, because I think that's when they start to reevaluate how they see themselves and they have a greater sense of self-esteem around the aging process.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just all deterioration and decline. You posted some archival video that I really enjoyed the other day, Maggie Kuhn being interviewed. Tell me about Maggie Kuhn, the founder of the Gray Panthers, and what you call the Maggie Kuhn Five.
Maggie Kuhn, who founded the Gray Panthers back in the 1970s, actually, I was under the impression that it was always a group of older adults advocating for the rights of older adults, but it was always an intergenerational group. And they started out with basic civil rights advocacy, and I think the great impetus for starting the group was around the Vietnam War. So she was always working with intergenerational groups around that issue. But they started to branch out more into ageism and issues around aging. And I loved the fact that she came up with these 5 roles. She believes that there are 5 roles that older adults can play. And to that, I've added a 6th. She said that older adults, first of all, could be mentors who teach the young. And I think most of us can see that and understand that. And she said they can also be mediators who resolve civil, racial, and intergenerational conflict. Maybe it's because as we get older, we gain more perspectives about life, and we are also able to mediate our own emotions well, that we become more natural communicators to others to see both sides of an issue.
This is a big aspect of the way the brain ages. We have more emotional regulation. We don't seem to sweat the small stuff like we did in our 40s even, or in our 20s, when everything was a major crisis.
Exactly. And another thing about the way our brains change as we get older is that we're born with this bridge of tissue that connects both hemispheres. When we're young, this very small bridge called the Corpus Callosum is very thin. You know, our brain hemispheres don't touch except for right in the middle where this bridge of tissue is. It doesn't fully mature until we're in our 50s, which means that once we're in our 50s, we have the greatest capacity to use both sides of our brain at the same time. And what does that mean in terms of relating to the world? Older adults problem solve differently than when we're younger. We can see an issue from more sides, from more perspectives simultaneously.
And that's a universal superpower then that needs to be reclassified as an asset for all over 50s.
Absolutely. And that's when I talk about that, people are really surprised to hear it. And then in a way, they're also not surprised because they say to me, you know, I've always sort of felt that as I've gotten older, I'm able to understand things better. And I say, yes, that's the bihemispheric problem solving power of the brain. So
you can prioritize issues. You know what's important. You know what's not. You can take that longer view and just blow it off if you decide that in the grand sweep of things, it's not that important.
That's right. And that is an additional asset of the older brain, is information discrimination. We know sooner and more accurately what piece of information is important in problem solving and what piece of information is not important. And I'm thinking back when I was a child, my grandmother used to say to me a lot of times, and I was very close with my maternal grandmother, she used to say, you know, Jeanette, I know you're bothered by this now, but when you get older, you're going to realize it wasn't that important. And boy, was she right. And that was that information discrimination. She knew what was important and what wasn't.
Well, this archival video that you posted on Twitter from Maggie Kuhn, it was 36 years ago. She touched on all the bases of the issue as we're now discussing it, which was fascinating on the one level, but soul shredding too, because not enough has changed. she was mentioning everything that we're still battling against.
Exactly. Although we're at a tipping point now where it's understandable why the anti-ageism movement is picking up now, as opposed to back when she was talking about it. And I think that video was from 1983. So yes, there's a reason why it's catching on more now, why we haven't solved those problems since then, but we're about to solve the problems now.
Well, let's hope so. Let's hope we're at this tipping point or inflection point. Now, you've mentioned the 2 M's, mentors, mediators, and there are 3 of hers, and you've added a 6th. Let's continue to go through those.
Sure. A third role is monitors. Older adults can be monitors of public bodies who serve as watchdogs of City Hall, of county government, of Parliament, of Congress. A lot of times older adults have more time than when we were in our middle age, when we were busy putting in, many hours at work. Some of us have more leisure now to actually sit in on governmental meetings. Are they doing their job? Are they going back on their word? So that's a very important role that older adults can play.
Yeah, I suppose that's tossed around a little bit now with the so-called retirement crisis and the end of retirement and, the 2008 crash, the cohort of people that do have a lot of time to devote on that aren't actually out there working, trying to work, who need to earn a living. So anyway, that's the bigger, more layered discussion. The next one is mobilizers as a role, one of the 5 that Maggie Kuhn identified.
Right. Mobilizers of social change. If you look at any videos today of protests in the streets, you'll see a significant number of older adults in the crowd. And mobilizers of social change, people can protest, they can write letters, they can be in the streets. And what great role models for younger generations to see older adults engaged in the same way. I think a lot of times people are eager to play generations against each other. But if you look around, you'll see that there are a lot of older adults who are very much in tune with younger causes, who want to support their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids. So mobilizers of social change, for sure.
Yeah, well, I think again, getting back to what you said, I do want to continue going through all these, but just to pause and think, and we are at an inflection point because that's changing. No one's accepting this, pitting the generations one against the other. We all just want to mix it up. Humans are humans are humans, no matter what chronological age they are. So hopefully we're moving beyond thinking that it's unusual to have an older person in the crowd. Older what? 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s? We're all enjoying the longevity revolution, and if we're lucky enough not to have illnesses that are debilitating, we can be anything to anyone.
That's right. Absolutely. Age is fluid. The concept of age is fluid. If you ask somebody, how old is an old person? It's really interesting that you'll get all kinds of responses. There was a survey done of people ages 5 years old to 75 years old. This was done about 5 years ago. And they asked people of all different ages, how old is an old person? The 5-year-olds tended to say on average around 13 years old was an old person. The 13-year-olds on average said 30 years old. The 30-year-olds said about 50. The 50-year-olds said about 65. And then people above 65 either tended to add about 15 years or so to their own age, or they would say the higher up they went, the older they were, they would say no age is old. And so when I give my presentations, I say the good news about aging is that, the concept of an old person is fluid. And the bad news is that no matter how old you are, someone thinks you're already old. So even if you're 13 years old, there's somebody out there who thinks you're already old. So age is something to just embrace. Whatever we are, wherever we are on the lifespan, that's okay. It should be fine. So.
Yeah, we need to keep reinforcing that message because it's the one everyone wants to embrace, and it's the only one that works.
Exactly. And why not? The point is, why not?
Maggie Kuhn's 5th is motivators.
Motivators of society who can urge people away from self-interest and toward the public good. Older adults can serve on boards of trustees or boards of directors or be on an advisory council of some kind and see if they can contribute, how they can contribute to asking people who are in charge of things, are you walking your talk? What is your mission? And how can I help you walk your talk? So motivators that urge people to do things for the public good. Those are her 5 roles. Then I thought about the fact that, what about someone, an older person, who is homebound or has severe dementia or is otherwise unable to engage in the same way that these 5 roles might dictate? Is there no place for a person like that? And I thought, yes, there is a place. We can all be models of what old age is about. Are we being treated with dignity? Are we being treated with respect? So no matter where an older person finds himself or herself in life, that person can be a model to other people as to the way age should be honored and treated with respect and autonomy.
And people can be encouraged to claim their role.
Right, exactly.
To not be shunted off into a corner and told to be quiet and wait until I can come back for you, and, not be patronized that way.
Right, exactly. And, these roles are fluid as well. They can intersect. You can be more than one role at the same time. And as many roles as you feel comfortable assuming, that's great. In that video that you were talking about with Maggie Kuhn, she mentioned the term senior citizen, how senior citizen is kind of a term that maybe baby boomers don't tend to like. And of course, I'm a baby boomer. I feel a little bit differently about it. I feel the way Maggie Kuhn feels. She said that senior citizen, the main word in that phrase is not so much senior, but citizen. How we can be responsible. The older we get, we can assume other kinds of responsibilities to help the rest of society. So I'm all for the idea of being called a senior citizen if it's taken in those proactive terms.
Let's move on to the second of the 3 tools that you use, Jeanette. Words, toxic words that can be directly or indirectly ageist.
I think a lot of our ageism comes from the fact that we're just so unconscious about it, that we have been so ingrained to assume certain things about age, that the language we use, we may not be aware that we're saying things that actually otherize older adults, create an us versus them scenario where the them are the older people that we don't want to be because we're so afraid of getting old, because all we see about getting old is that it's bad, which is totally wrong. So we create words that will distance ourselves from them, and they can be directly ageist, like a phrase like over the hill, which drives me nuts, basically. But you know what I tell people? When someone says someone is over the hill, you see these birthday cards. It's based on the fact that the assumption that older people can't change, that you hit a certain peak and after that it's downhill, you're not productive anymore. I like to tell older adults that far from being averse to change, we are the master climbers. We have had so much experience climbing that when we get to the top of that hill, what we see are other hills to climb. And we see those other hills only because we have the perspective of being where we are now. So being at the top of the hill gives us that ability to see other places, to go in other directions.
And we just keep on climbing hill to hill to hill.
Right. We're the master climbers. We are the master changers. When any of us think about and you take any object, what was it like when you were a kid? What was a washing machine like when you were a kid? What was a telephone like when you were a kid? Just even the technology, we have gone through and adjusted all along the way. So when another stereotype, older adults can't handle technology, that's total nonsense. We have handled technology for decades, and we can keep handling technology. As a matter of fact, about 80% of people over the age of 65 go online on a daily basis. So that should change people's minds about the fact that older adults can't deal with technology.
It's become a lazy cliche that older adults can't deal with technology. And some adults don't deal with technology well, and they never have, from when they were 30 through what they might be now 70. They'd rather listen to a composer deliver beautiful music. So, I mean, it's all what our passions are. All of these lazy cliches and stereotypes just need to be banished.
Right. And one major misunderstanding about older adults is that we're all alike. That as we get old, all old people are alike. Well, that is such a false perception because of the fact that as we get older, we become more different from one another. The way I like to explain it is to imagine a tree. When we're younger, we have certain experiences, and as we get older, those experiences and decisions we make lead us to other experiences and other decisions. And so we're kind of branching out and we become more different from one another the older we get.
And it would be really nice if we could quit this lack of segmentation. It's always 65 plus. And I always think, man, if I was 82 That would piss me off. That I'm being denied recognition even on a form. I'm 65 plus, and that's it. One big amorphous blob.
Right. And given the fact that many of us could actually live into our hundreds, the difference between being 65 and being 100 to any individual person could be the difference between being 20 and 40 or 20 and 60. I mean, we wouldn't lump 20-year-olds with 60-year-olds? Why would we lump 65-year-olds with 100-year-olds? I think it goes back, though, to the shorter lifespan. I think we're still operating under the old assumption that 65 is the life expectancy, which is what it was in 1935 when in the United States we created Social Security. So
this is the whole basis of the podcast, that the three-stage life model no longer fits what our lifespan is. And it needs to catch up on all of these different levels. And it's only in the last 200 years that we have adopted these social constructs that are now biting all older people in the butt because the model hasn't caught up with reality.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about that, I'll have some surprising things to say about that. Sure.
Well, let's go to your second tool in your little toolbox, words. And you've got some strategies for changing our language, making sure that it evolves.
Well, first of all, we need to retire some terms like cranky or grumpy or over the hill, as I said, or doddering. When was the last time anybody called a 30-year-old doddering? We need to take some of these terms and just not use them anymore. Not to say that we should historically forget them. If you look up over the hill in a dictionary, actually some dictionaries still say that it is old age and a place of uselessness. What I'd like to see the dictionaries do is add the fact that it's a pejorative, that it is a negative term. That's archaic. I'd like to see it become an archaic term. So we need to just get rid of some terms and stop using them. Another strategy is to find other non-loaded words as substitutes. So instead of saying the elderly, which puts us all into this one lump category that we're all alike, we're coming up with other terms like elders or older adults or olders, as Ashton likes to say.
I like her youngers and olders because as she was explaining it to me, it just gets tiresome when you're writing a book like she did, saying older people, older people, older people. And it's so much handier and neater to say youngers and olders.
Yes, and the fact that we're all on a spectrum. Remember, we have to change our ideas in order to then be able to act more civilly toward one another. It starts between our ears. So if we get used to saying olders rather than the elderly, we will start to think of people in a different way and act toward them differently.
I even had a guest recently on the podcast, and he was 52, and he was continuously referring to, when the elderly, and I didn't call him up on it, but I was quite surprised that that was the term he was using. And we were talking about over 55s. We weren't talking about people in the last 2, 3, 5 years of their life.
Right, exactly. And I think sometimes what I have found is that people who are in the aging services professions, a lot of times tend to lag behind the changes in language because the people that they are serving are usually a subpopulation of all older adults. And so they tend to see older adults as kind of needing of their services because that's their job, to serve these people.
You also say that one of your strategies is to redefine words that used to be toxic.
Yeah, embrace and redefine the toxic terms. So, in other words, a word like crone, sometimes in many people's ears, sounds like hag, an old lady. But crone is actually an ancient term for a wise woman, where, just like the word sage would be a wise man. Well, crone is a positive term. We older adult women need to aspire, if we don't already feel like we're crones, we should aspire to be crones.
I think it's going to be a tough one, rehabilitating the word crone. I just can see that one maybe taking a few more generations when you and I are gone. I don't think that one's going to fly.
Well, I tell you what, we'll talk about this in a bit, but I think everything is going to speed up. And one of the main reasons is because of social media. I think it's going to take within a generation. I think crone will be acceptable. And I think the women's movement had a lot to do with making it a more acceptable term, but it's got to be more widely accepted.
You also, in your tweets, in your articles, you are constantly reinforcing that the process of aging must be viewed as an asset.
Yes. Absolutely. There are assets to aging. We are basically acquiring a new brain, as I've talked a little bit about before. We have other skills. As we lose some cognitive abilities, we gain some other abilities that explain why we may slow down a little bit in our thinking. For example, we have billions, if we keep our brains healthy, we have billions more brain cells in our heads than we did when we were in our 30s. Billions more. And those brain cells have trillions more connections, have made trillions more connections through experience, through learning, through increasing our knowledge. So when we have these, what another phrase I can't stand, senior moments, because everybody forgets things, and that forgetfulness can start in your 20s. While it may take us a little while to recall certain things, it can be precisely because our brain has many more connections and many more pathways for a single signal to go across. So it will take us longer to get the information.
So with all of these additional brain cells, we've got better pattern recognition, but
Right.
Isn't the thing that the processing power is that little bit slower?
Yes, it is. And it is slower because picture a map of superhighways, of millions and millions of superhighways. If we're lucky and if we've treated our brains well and kept our brains healthy, that's what our brains should look like. A whole bunch of superhighways. So that if one highway collapses because of, I don't know, concrete or an earthquake or something, and part of it collapses, we have all of these other bypasses to get us through. So older adults have more what's called crystallized intelligence, longer term memories. We have better long-term memories than younger people do, which sounds kind of counterintuitive because you would think, well, they have less to remember. Why wouldn't their long-term memory be as good? It's because we have built all of these superhighways and we have more access, more ways to get to the material. It just takes us a little longer, that's all. But
because there's more material to forge through.
There's more material to forge through. So if our brains are like libraries and you tell a 30-year-old to go find War and Peace, and that library in that 30-year-old brain has 100,000 volumes, that 30-year-old can find War and Peace pretty quickly. If you tell a 70-year-old with a healthy brain, go find me War and Peace, instead of 100,000 volumes, that library has 100 million volumes. It's going to take longer to find War and Peace. But the asset to having that big library is that the older brain can then say, hey, and if you like War and Peace, I got 20 other books I can recommend to you.
Fantastic. Okay, let's move on to the third tool in your arsenal, actions, employing effective communication strategies.
Yes, well, I love the power of storytelling. There is nothing like telling a story to get a point across. And I think that's what we could and should be doing. Because older adults old people have wonderful stories in them and an infinite number of stories in them. Older adults have some amazing stories that are historically based because they've lived through certain decades that other people haven't lived through, or they've traveled in certain ways or whatever. We should be relying on storytelling to get across the point that aging is, we become richer in certain ways the longer we live. So when you tell somebody, if I were to say to you, okay, Susan, now I'm going to talk about, that's one way of presenting information. But if I say to you, hey, Susan, once upon a time, that phrase alone kind of changes our brain and makes us aware on a different level.
Well, I think once upon a time, we're all back in bed with our mothers or fathers about to read us a great story.
Exactly. And that once upon a time is a signal that something is special. You're about to hear something special. So one strategy is storytelling. Another is to use specific, personal, relevant, surprising examples and thought experiments. Come up with weird and interesting ways of presenting something, like I just did with the library, a library of 100,000 books or 100 million books. Find interesting ways of presenting the material so that it makes people think like, oh, I never thought of it that way before. That's a very powerful way we can disrupt ageism.
From what I know of your output, I've come to the conclusion that you approach pretty much everything from the side. You don't kind of go head on, and you come up with the analogies and the metaphors that bring the material to life.
Well, thank you. Yes, that is what I love to do, because I love to see the reactions of people when I present something in an unexpected way. And by the way, in terms of brain health, we tend to remember things the more unusual they are. So here's a good memory trick. If you want to remember something, find an image in your mind that's kind of wacky that relates to that image, and chances are you might remember it better than if you just tried to either memorize a phrase or remember it as a piece of fact or information. The stranger, the better. Our brains love variety. Our brains love challenge. Our brains love surprise.
You mentioned thought experiments. One that you use packs such a wallop. I'd like you to tell us about Child in Decline.
Okay, so what if I were to tell you, Susan, that, I got some bad news for you. You and I, as we're getting older, we're really children in decline. We've reached our fertility potential. We've stopped growing in cranial volume and body height. We've lost muscle mass annually since we're in our 30s. We're losing our memory capacity every year slightly. Our chromosome telomeres, the ends of our chromosomes are getting shorter all the time. We're losing the ability to learn language and math concepts with great ease, effortlessly. And finally, we don't offer society a refreshing sense of innocence anymore. We're really children in decline. Now, how do you feel when I tell you something like that?
With so much negativity. You just feel like packing up your tent and going home now. Never mind the rest of it.
Right, exactly. Well, when I use this thought experiment, when I present it to people, and usually people are either older adults or midlife people, they get angry. They say, what do you mean I'm a child in decline? How can you possibly say that? I'm so much different from a child. I have so many other skills than I had when I was a kid. So I say, okay, the way you feel now, well, imagine midlife people telling older people that they are midlife people in decline, that we are middle-aged people in decline, because we are expected to produce in the same way or at the same capacity or volume as middle-aged people. That's denying the assets of aging that we acquire that we may not have even been able to get in our midlife. Remember that Corpus Callosum matures when we're in our 50s. So that's like denying the fact that there aren't any special qualifications or characteristics or traits that we develop as older people that are different from midlife people. The older we get, the closer we get to our mortality, which isn't to say we could die at any age, obviously, but mortality becomes more of a presence in our thoughts, and it makes us value time in a different way and more preciously. And that can be a real asset in older age because we don't take things for granted in the same way that we did when we were in our 40s or 30s or 20s.
Do you think we become more intentional about our choices, how we spend our time?
Yes, absolutely. I know many people, and this is including me, we choose with whom to spend our time. We may not put up with relationships that we had more patience with when 40 years ago. We decided, no, this isn't the way I choose to spend my time. Let me do something else. And a lot of times, older adults want to be spending our time with a purpose, with a new kind of purpose. Whereas we may have had a different kind of purpose in our 20s and 30s, of making a living, establishing a family, building a career. As we get older, our thoughts, our eyes, and our hearts start to look more outward to society as a whole. And what can we be doing for other people? And that is a sense of what psychologist Erik Erikson called generativity, a desire to leave a legacy, to make a difference. And I think that is a real asset of older age. Now,
and this usually hits when? 60s, 70s?
It can vary from person to person. I mean, there are people in their 30s who are very generative in their outlook. They're very giving and very outward looking in society. But in general, we tend to acquire that trait between, let's say, late 50s and then in our 60s. And then as we get even older than that, according to Erikson, we come up with another trait, a personality development trait called integrity, putting it all together, having a sense of what does this all mean? How did my life fit into the greater aspect of others' lives? What's my life been about? And those are just very rich questions we could be asking ourselves as we get older. I know that there are people who feel that there is no such thing as elder wisdom. And there are, older adults who we may not call wise because of the fact that they may not have pursued that in any way. My take is, as we get older, because of the ways our brains change, we have the potential for something called elder wisdom, which is a different type of wisdom than any other kind of wisdom as we were younger. You could be a wise teenager, a wise 20-year-old. It's not knowledge. Wisdom is not the same as knowledge. Knowledge is what you've collected as facts. Wisdom is how you apply that knowledge and how you apply it in good and productive and effective ways.
And is it again back to, perspectives and pattern recognition over time?
Yes, exactly. And to the extent that older adults can and do take advantage of the ways in which they're changing, they have that potential. We all have that potential to develop in wisdom. And I guess this comes to the point of the concept of successful aging. What does it mean if we're aging successfully? Some of it has to do with our individual choices and how we choose to spend our lives and take care of ourselves and all of that. But a great deal also has to do with whether or not we were supported in general by society all along the way, whether or not we had opportunities for education, or whether or not we were born poor or born in a rural area or born a minority or born female as opposed to male. We all know that income inequality is a societal construct. It doesn't have to do with our genes. It has to do with the way we see one another, we limit one another's potential.
But do you like defining anyone with that descriptive, using that term successful aging? How can you define success? If you're getting older year after day after year, you're lucky. You're just lucky to still be living. Find your happiness and your worth and your purpose however you can. That is successful. And why would you even need to define it?
Well, I think, first of all, if you Google the phrase successful aging, you will see millions of hits, but almost invariably they talk about individual responsibility, how to save more money, how to eat right and exercise every day. It's all the individual's responsibility.
Yeah, it's health and financial advice in the main.
Right, exactly. And I also don't like that term successful aging because of that fact, because it puts all of the onus on the individual. I feel it's a 50-50. It's the individual plus the society. We have to be in a society that supports aging, that accepts aging, and that will support people through every stage of life. I prefer the term empowered aging. Let's all be empowered at any age. Let's be the best teenagers we can be. Let's be the best middle-aged people we can be. Why can't we be the best old people we can be? But it's a societal question of whether or not we have policies that will help us to do that.
Yeah, well, that's where the big gap is. And I've heard you speak about research confirming that there's what you call a massive knowledge gap around aging. What experts like you know about it and what most of the general populace thinks about it. All the negativity that we're steeped in from a lifetime of learning that being young is the only state of being that's worth being.
Right, exactly. And actually, the organization that has done incredible work in this way is the Frameworks Institute. In 2015, they published something called Gauging Aging. And they came up with the fact that here's the difference between what the experts know and what the average person knows. There are 5 false perceptions about aging that they came up with, and they are spot on. So the first one is, we've talked about this, the negative understanding of aging, that it's solely deterioration and decline, that there's nothing good, it's just all downhill, we're over the hill, and that's it. The second I've just touched upon, which is the idea of individualism, which means successful aging just depends on you as an individual, that you are totally responsible for how well you age.
You failed if you somehow aren't rocketing around like you were in your 30s. I mean, we have to be more realistic about there will be a degree of physiological change, no matter how many Pilates classes you do.
Exactly. We don't need to be Pollyannas about aging, that it's all wonderful and roses and that all old people are exceptional. I mean, I could never run a marathon, and I don't expect I ever will. And I don't want to even try. I have other things that I'm busy doing. The pendulum has to go in the middle somewhere. We have to be realistic. There are good things and there are bad things we experience as we get older, but it's how we deal with those and how we create a society that helps us deal with those. And then the third false perception is the lack of understanding of demographic changes. The fact that the world is getting older, that's reality. For the first time in human history, we're going to have more older people over, let's say, the age of 60 or 65 than kids on this planet.
This very year, that's the one stat that I always like to trot out because there are
Mhm.
so many different statistics around. But by the end of this year, globally, there will be more 65-year-olds than 5-year-olds for
Right.
the first time in 200 years.
Right, right. Here's another interesting statistic. A child born today has a 50-50 chance of being a centenarian, of reaching 100 years old. A 1 in 2 shot. What are we going to do with the fact that we have all of these older people that have incredible skills and talents and experiences that they can share? And if we're keeping that locked up, the entire planet suffers.
This is, again, the essence of the podcast. It's very much pinned to that demographic reality, the revolution that we're living in now. And the 3-stage life model no longer fits. We need to
Right.
have 60-year careers of a 100-year life, constant changing. And policymakers, governments, and civil society as well don't seem to be engaging in any sort of coherent fashion to address this demographic reality.
That's right. Well, the two greatest shifts in the globe, population's getting older and climate change. And the two can go hand in hand. We can work towards solving both problems. There's that intersectionality of all of these causes. Whatever the prejudice is, racism, sexism, ageism, when you help one, you help all of them. And we need to be working on all of them at the same time. The fourth false perception is absent ageism, where we basically don't see ageism around us. Now, as we get older, most older adults do see ageism because we experience it. I mean, I've literally had people walk into me on a sidewalk, just bump into me as if I physically was not there.
I haven't met you yet, but you don't look like an ethereal human being. You look quite a substantial person. I haven't had that happen to me yet. I'm a little bit younger than you. Is this what I have to look forward to, being taken out like a skittle on a sidewalk?
Well, it depends on a lot of societal factors. One, it could be a really crowded street to start out with. But also it depends on whether or not people are checking their cell phones or if they're, hailing a cab or whatever. But I've literally been walked into more often than when I was younger.
That happens all the time. And I think it happens to younger people, it happens to everyone. Yeah. People don't walk anymore with their eyes to the front. They are walking quickly into you all the time, blocking your path and meandering along, watching videos on their phones. I don't get it. I really don't.
I know. But I've noticed that and maybe it is along with social media and all of that, but I have actually had people bump into me who were not on their cell phones, who they were just chatting with their friends or, whatever. But
you call this absent ageism, and I'm struggling to understand what you mean with the example you've given. So try another one, please.
Okay, so absent ageism, where you don't realize that the term, perhaps that what you're calling somebody is an ageist comment. You don't see ageism around you. So if you call an older person young lady, what can I do for you, young lady? You think you're giving them a compliment. You think it's kind of nice, and you don't realize that is ageism. It could be ageism to the person hearing that comment. Or people who say older people need to get out of the workforce and let younger people give the jobs to younger people. Get out of the way and make room for the younger generation. Not only is it ageism, but it's also counterproductive because it turns out as companies that have intergenerational teams and retain older adults in the workplace are usually more productive than companies that aren't.
Well, there's the lump of labor fallacy.
Right.
Which, it's a fallacy. And also in the UK alone, I know this statistic off by heart, we only are producing 7 million new people, and we have 12 million to 14 million jobs that need filling over the next 5 years. So there's an inverted age pyramid going on that people are not recognizing. So you don't need the older people to shuffle on over, because there's plenty of work around for everyone, as long as the barriers are not erected for older people, because that's what tends to happen. Older people get marginalized. Every OECD country, this is happening, where people over 55, 60, depending on their sector, they are forced out of the workplace.
Right. And the thing is, if more managers understood the science behind the older brain, I think that's what might convince them, because, everyone can be talking about all of these soft ideas like it's the moral thing to do, or consider the fact that old people have abilities too. But when you start to tell them about the actual ways in which an older brain can serve a company in a way that complements what a young brain can contribute to a company, that might actually convince them. So that's why I think brain fitness and brain education can be very important in combating ageism. It's telling businesses, hey, you want your bottom line to grow? One of the best things you can do is to retain older adults in the workplace, train them in the ways that they need to be trained, and put them together with young people on teams, and you will see your company flourish.
This is a big aspect of the lopsided society that we've made for ourselves over the past 2 centuries. The question you often hear is, well, what's the point of old people? What's their evolutionary worth? And since the Industrial Revolution, the metric for merit is productivity that generates wealth. And that seems to be the only metric that is given any value.
Well, and the thing is, we have to redefine productivity, because if we're defining productivity solely in terms of what middle-aged people do, we're missing out on a whole bunch of other productivity that older adults can supply. Remember Maggie Kuhn's 5 roles? Well, how many midlife people who are busy working at their jobs can also be mediators, monitors, mobilizers, mentors? They can do some of it, but we've got a whole, what I call a silver reservoir of talent that's being pent up. Why don't we open up those gates and irrigate our society with all of those ideas and wisdom and experienced people, and we could be rebuilding this planet, in a healthy way. So that actually is the 5th point of the Frameworks Institute, is fatalism, the sense that there's nothing we can do about it. Let's just give up, don't even bother. We can't solve the problem. The problems are actually quite solvable if we can recognize how to solve them. And that will, as we defeat ageism, those solutions will go hand in hand.
A lot of really core restructuring has to go on in society. We can't have people living a life model that tops out at 55. We can't just have people go to university, let's say if you get a postgraduate degree, 25, you might even graduate in your late 20s or 30s. And then what? You're only valued in the workplace for 20 years? We have to redesign, overhaul all of the structures so that we can have lifelong learning and people can have 60-year textured careers, these transitions that they're going through all the time. Not being this, the silver tsunami that people talk about, draining the resources of society and causing all of this false anxiety.
Well, and that's why I think that we're at a tipping point right now in terms of the anti-ageism movement. There are certain factors, I think, that is going to allow for this change to really take off. And it is taking off, I think. We have to undo millennia of ageist ideas about older adults. Actually, there were 2 major historical points at which older adults, their value in society shifted downward. One was the invention of the printing press, because once older adult wisdom, which was passed down orally, how do you read the crops? How do you know the cycles of the seasons? How do you know what to do and when to do it? Once that information could be recorded and stored, older adult value went down in terms of society. And then the Industrial Revolution, when people moved from living on the farm to coming into the cities and getting jobs in factories, where a lot of the work was done by middle-aged labor that older people were not being or could not be trained to handle these new machines. That then also devalued the older adult population and redefined them as a needy population. And so that's when a lot of social policies came through. And then with the coming of, as I said, social security, kinds of policies.
Well, even before that, in the 19th century, governments were starting to socially mark out lifespans in birthdays. They became the archivists of the chronological age of everyone, and, progressively devaluing over 50s.
Right, exactly. So we've had this, this has happened for millennia, we're undoing a prejudice that's been around for thousands of years. But I think we're at a tipping point now for a number of reasons. But one of the main reasons is the baby boomer generation, which is our generation, yours and mine. We were the generation that was first. We've changed every aspect of the life course as we've gone through it. We were the first generation to be marketed to directly as children. I don't know what it was like in England in the 50s and 60s, but in the United States, Saturday morning cartoons started with us. being marketed to with Hopalong Cassidy wristwatches and Roy Rogers lunch pails and Barbie dolls. We were marketed to directly as children.
Well, I grew up on the Canada-U.S. border, so I saw the same cartoons you did.
Okay.
The same marketing drives, snap, crackle, pop, all of that.
Right, exactly. And then we changed what it was like to be a teenager and in college. We had all of the we had a history of living through activist movements in the 60s and 70s. So activism and protesting, even if we may never have done it particularly ourselves, it's not a new thing to us. So we had the women's movement, the environmental movement, the civil rights movement. And then recently, with all of these not reactivization, but intensification of movements like Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, the Women's March, the Me Too movement, the Student March for Our Lives with gun control in the United States. So we're at this tipping point where protesting is taking on an even greater intensity. And then we're also experiencing the ongoing pain of the 2008 recession, economic recession, where us baby boomers, we actually lost an average of 40% of our retirement savings in the bust in 2008. And many of us lost our jobs. Here's an interesting fact that people, when they have this image of the greedy geezer, that all older adults are rich and holding on to their wealth. In the United States, the median annual income of people above the age of 65 is $25,000, which I guess it's about 19,000 pounds. 50% of 65 plus people have an income below that, and 50% have a median income above that. That's not very much money.
No, not at all. I mean, everything has changed. It's precarious for everyone across the age spectrum. 2008 gutted a lot of the savings accounts and the expectations of a lot of over 50s. But millennials, Gen Xers, everyone is hard scrabbling now to figure out what next, because we've also had so much sectoral disruption.
Right, exactly. So if you take all of these factors and put them together, the fact that baby boomers, we're not going gentle into that good night. We're used to getting our way in a certain way. We're used to speaking up, speaking our minds. That plus all of this excitement and these social movements gaining in intensity, plus the income inequality and awareness of it and protests of it, I think we are ripe for this anti-ageism movement. I think this is where we now can start to make big strides in ways that we couldn't for hundreds of years or even for millennia. So
yes, absolutely. And activating across the spectrum on all the causes that divide us and poison society in general for all of us humans, no matter what our ages.
So actually, you just come up with 3 ways in which we need to be working interdependently, intergenerationally, and intersectionally. And those are the 3 ways. If we do all of that, we can be working toward repairing our planet and saving ourselves.
What's at stake, Jeanette, if we don't take steps to adapt to this time of unprecedented demographic change? There's no going back on this. And the public and private sector and civil society are seemingly distracted, no matter what we get up to in our efforts to raise social consciousness. They seem distracted and complacent, fighting the many fires of the day, instead of doing concrete forward planning.
What's at stake? Everything is at stake. Humankind, in certain ways, we never change. Our backs have to absolutely be up against the wall in order for us to act. We are acting, and I think very soon we're going to, hopefully globally, we will be making some changes, fundamental changes, not only in our environment, but in our political scene and the ways we relate to one another. We have to. We have no choice. But I'm hopeful. I do see things are changing.
Yeah, well, there is a growing global clamor for social justice and social change.
Right, exactly. And ageism is just a part of that. It's one of the many isms that happen, and we are realizing we've been wrong, and we need to change it, and we will.
Well, I share your optimism, and hopefully things will start to move along in more visible, coherent ways. Jeanette Leardi, social gerontologist, writer, speaker, educator, well worth reading and following. You will learn plenty. Thanks so much, Jeanette, for coming on The Big Middle.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's been a real pleasure.
Ways to connect with Jeanette and links to her glorious output in the show notes. Next week on The Big Middle, social entrepreneur and author Mark Friedman. Instead of trying to be young, he writes in How to Live Forever, his latest book, live forever by being there for the young. Head to fiveasidechess.com to learn all about the sponsor of The Big Middle. Five Aside Chess is on a mission to end loneliness by getting people to connect over chessboards. Thanks so much for listening, and let's keep the conversation going on Twitter. I'm @TheBigMiddlePod. Ciao for now.